December 16, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were silent, blanketed in snow, the trees standing like sentinels in the frozen dawn. For weeks, the American soldiers stationed along this quiet sector of the Western Front had grown accustomed to the monotony of winter warfare. The war, they believed, was winding down. The German army, battered and retreating, seemed incapable of launching another major offensive. The men of the 106th Infantry Division, many of them fresh from the United States, had been told this was a quiet sector. They were replacements, green and untested, sent to hold a line that, on paper, was secure. But beneath the snow and silence, a storm was gathering. In the darkness, more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, prepared to launch Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The plan was audacious, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes aimed at splitting the Allied armies, capturing the port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace. The codename was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, but history would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. At the heart of this unfolding drama was a single catastrophic mistake, a decision made in the fog of war, underestimating the enemy's capacity for surprise and deception. It was a mistake that would doom an entire American division, shatter the illusion of Allied invincibility, and change the course of the war in Europe. This is the untold story of how one error, born of overconfidence and misjudgment, led to the destruction of the 106th Infantry Division, and how its consequences rippled through the battlefields of Belgium and beyond. The story begins not with the thunder of artillery, but with the quiet confidence of Allied commanders. By December 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris, driven the Germans from France, and stood poised on the borders of the Reich. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and his generals believed the enemy was finished, capable only of desperate, localized resistance. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and rugged terrain, was considered an unlikely place for a major attack. Intelligence reports noted increased German activity, but these warnings were dismissed as the last gasps of a defeated foe. Into this sector, the 106th Infantry Division was deployed. The division was new, its men barely acclimated to the realities of combat. They replaced the battle-hardened 2nd Infantry Division, which had been pulled out for rest and refit. The 106th regiments, 422nd, 423rd, and 424th, were spread thinly across a 21-mile front, far wider than standard doctrine recommended. The terrain was difficult, communications were unreliable, and the men were still learning to work together. Yet, the orders were clear: hold the line. The mistake, in retrospect, seems almost inevitable. Allied intelligence, lulled by months of success, failed to recognize the scale and intent of the German buildup. Reports of enemy movements, intercepted radio traffic, and prisoner interrogations all pointed to something larger than a spoiling attack. But the prevailing belief was that the Germans lacked the resources for a major offensive. The 106th, understrength and inexperienced, was left to defend a sector that would soon become the focal point of the greatest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. As dawn broke on December 16th, the illusion of safety was shattered. The German artillery barrage began at 5:30 a.m., a rolling thunder that shook the earth and tore through the American positions. Shells rained down on command posts, supply dumps, and communication lines. The men of the 106th, many still in their foxholes, were caught in a maelstrom of fire and confusion. Within minutes, the German infantry surged forward, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. The attack was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. The 422nd and 423rd Regiments, holding the Schnee Eifel, a ridge of wooded hills jutting into German territory, were quickly isolated. The Germans, using infiltration tactics perfected on the Eastern Front, bypassed strongpoints and cut off roads and supply lines. American units found themselves surrounded, their radios jammed, their calls for artillery support unanswered. The fog of war descended, thick and impenetrable. In the chaos, the division's commanders struggled to make sense of the situation. Major General Allen W. Jones, the 106th's commander, was faced with impossible choices. Should he order a breakout, risking annihilation in the open, or should his men dig in and wait for relief, hoping that reinforcements would arrive before the Germans closed the trap? The decision was complicated by conflicting reports, broken communications, and the sheer speed of the German advance. The mistake, the fatal error, was not a single decision, but a series of misjudgments that compounded with each passing hour. The division's thin deployment, the underestimation of German strength, The failure to reinforce vulnerable positions and the reliance on faulty intelligence all played a part. But at its core, the disaster was rooted in a belief that the enemy was beaten, that the war was nearly won, and that the Ardennes was a backwater. As the day wore on, the situation grew desperate. The 422nd and 423rd Regiments, cut off from the rest of the division, fought valiantly to hold their ground. Ammunition ran low, food and water became scarce, and the wounded piled up in makeshift aid stations. The Germans, sensing victory, pressed their attack with relentless determination. By December 18th, the two regiments were surrounded, their positions untenable. In the freezing darkness, the American commanders faced a grim reality. With no hope of relief, no way to break out, and no supplies left, surrender became the only option. On December 19th, more than 7,000 men of the 106th Infantry Division laid down their arms, the largest mass surrender of American troops in Europe during World War II. The mistake had become a catastrophe. The impact was immediate and profound. The loss of the 106th regiments created a gap in the Allied lines, allowing the Germans to pour through and threaten key supply routes. Panic spread through the rear areas as rumors of German infiltrators and disguised commandos circulated. The psychological shock was as great as the tactical setback. For the first time since D-Day, the Allies faced the real possibility of defeat in the West. Yet even in the midst of disaster, acts of heroism and resilience shone through. Small groups of American soldiers, cut off and surrounded, fought on against impossible odds. Medics tended to the wounded under fire, chaplains comforted the dying, and officers tried to maintain order in the chaos. The story of the 106th is not just one of defeat, but of courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. The consequences of the mistake rippled outward. Eisenhower and his staff, shocked by the scale of the German attack, scrambled to organize a response. Reinforcements were rushed to the front, supply lines were rerouted, and new defensive positions were established. The Battle of the Bulge became a test of Allied resolve, a crucible in which the outcome of the war would be decided. In the days that followed, the 106th's survivors were scattered. Some marched into captivity, others escaped through the forests. A few managed to rejoin friendly lines. Their ordeal was far from over. In the German prison camps, they faced hunger, cold, and brutality. For many, the memory of those days in the Ardennes would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But the story does not end with defeat. The mistake that doomed the 106th Infantry Division became a lesson, one paid for in blood and suffering, but not forgotten. The Allies learned the dangers of complacency, the importance of vigilance, and the cost of underestimating a desperate enemy. The Battle of the Bulge, born of one fatal error, became a turning point in the war, a reminder that victory is never certain, and that the smallest misjudgment can have consequences beyond imagining. As the snow fell on the shattered forests of the Ardennes, the men of the 106th Infantry Division became part of history. Their sacrifice, their suffering, and their courage in the face of disaster would be remembered, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The untold story of how one mistake doomed an entire army is not just a story of loss, but of endurance, redemption, and the enduring power of hope. The surrender of the 106th Infantry Division's 422nd and 423rd Regiments sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure. In the war rooms of Paris and London, generals pored over maps, trying to understand how such a disaster could have unfolded so quickly. The news was met with disbelief, then anger, and finally a grim determination to prevent the collapse from spreading. For the men on the ground, however, there was no time for reflection, only survival. In the days following the surrender, the German advance pressed relentlessly westward. The roads through the Ardennes, once thought impassable for large armored formations, now echoed with the rumble of panzers and the tramp of infantry boots. The German plan, meticulously crafted by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and executed by some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, relied on speed, surprise, and the exploitation of Allied weaknesses. The destruction of the 106th Regiments had opened a gaping hole in the American lines, and the Germans wasted no time in exploiting it. Yet even as the enemy surged forward, the seeds of their own undoing were being sown. The German columns, stretched thin by the rapid advance, began to encounter logistical problems. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and the sheer difficulty of moving through the snow-choked forests slowed their progress. American engineers, working feverishly, blew bridges and laid mines, turning every crossroads into a potential death trap. The initial shock of the offensive was giving way to a grinding, attritional struggle. For the men of the 106th who had not been captured, the ordeal was far from over. Scattered across the forests and villages of the Ardennes, small groups of soldiers fought desperate rearguard actions, harassing the enemy and buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. In the village of St. Vite, a key road junction, elements of the 106th, reinforced by the 7th Armored Division and other units, mounted a stubborn defense. For 6 days, they held out against repeated German assaults, their resistance delaying the enemy's timetable and preventing a complete breakthrough. Inside the German lines, the captured Americans began the long march into captivity. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in memory, and the prisoners, stripped of their heavy coats and forced to walk for miles without food or water, suffered terribly. Many would not survive the journey. Those who did found themselves in overcrowded prison camps, where disease, starvation, and brutality were daily realities. The mistake that had doomed their division now condemned them to months of hardship and uncertainty. Back at the front, the battle raged on. The initial German gains had been spectacular, but the offensive was beginning to lose momentum. The Allies, shocked but not broken, responded with speed and determination. General Eisenhower, recognizing the gravity of the situation, released reserves from all over the Western Front. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed to the besieged town of Bastogne, where it would become the focal point of the battle. Patton's Third Army, executing a remarkable pivot to the north, prepared to relieve the encircled defenders. The contrast between the initial German success and the growing Allied response was stark. In the first days of the offensive, the Germans had achieved complete surprise, exploiting the complacency and overconfidence of their enemies. But as the battle wore on, the limitations of their plan became apparent. The terrain, so well suited to defense, now worked against the attackers. The weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft and masked the German buildup, began to clear, allowing American and British planes to strike at the vulnerable columns. For the survivors of the 106th, the battle was a blur of confusion, fear, and exhaustion. In the chaos of retreat and counterattack, units became intermingled, orders were lost or misunderstood, and the line between friend and foe blurred. Stories abound of American soldiers stumbling into German positions, of tanks firing on their own infantry in the fog and snow, of desperate last stands in isolated farmhouses and villages. The Ardennes became a landscape of chaos where the normal rules of war seemed suspended. Yet, amid the confusion, acts of leadership and heroism emerged. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, thrust into command by the loss of their superiors, rallied their men and organized defenses. Medics risked their lives to tend to the wounded under fire. Chaplains comforted the dying, often at great personal risk. The story of the 106th is not just one of defeat, but of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The psychological impact of the disaster was profound. For the first time since Normandy, the American army faced the real possibility of a major defeat. Rumors of German infiltrators disguised as American soldiers spread panic through the rear areas. Checkpoints sprang up everywhere, and every soldier was subjected to questions about baseball, movie stars, and state capitals, anything to prove their American identity. The sense of security that had grown since the summer was shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. In the higher echelons of command, the loss of the 106th forced a reckoning. How had such a mistake been made? How had the enemy achieved such surprise? The answers were complex, rooted in the fog of war, the limitations of intelligence, and the human tendency to underestimate a desperate foe. Reports of German activity in the Ardennes had been dismissed as diversionary, the warnings of local civilians ignored, the lessons of past battles forgotten. The price of complacency was paid in blood. As the battle entered its second week, the tide began to turn. The German advance slowed, then stalled, as fuel shortages and Allied resistance took their toll. The defenders of Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, held out against repeated attacks, their defiance symbolized by General McAuliffe's famous reply to a German surrender demand, "Nuts." Patton's tanks broke through the encirclement on December the 26th, relieving the town and restoring hope to the battered defenders. For the men of the 106th, the relief came too late. The regiments lost in the Schnee-Eifel would not be reconstituted. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain. By holding out as long as they did, by fighting in the face of impossible odds, they bought time for the Allies to regroup and counterattack. The mistake that doomed their division became a rallying point, a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of vigilance. In the aftermath of the battle, the survivors of the 106th were scattered. Some returned to their units, others were sent home, their health broken by wounds or captivity. The division itself was rebuilt, but it would never again play a major role in the fighting. For many, the memory of the Ardennes would remain a lifelong scar, a reminder of the thin line between victory and defeat and the terrible cost of war. The story of the 106th Infantry Division is a microcosm of the larger battle. It is a story of men caught in the whirlwind of history, their fate determined by decisions made far above their heads. It is a story of courage and endurance, of mistakes and redemption, of the human spirit tested to its limits. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the resilience of those who fought and suffered in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. As the new year dawned, the Battle of the Bulge drew to a close. The German offensive had failed, its objectives unmet, its armies shattered. The Allies resumed their advance, pushing inexorably toward the Rhine and the heart of the Third Reich. But the lessons of the Ardennes would not be forgotten. The mistake that doomed the 106th became a warning, a reminder that in war, as in life, the smallest error can have the greatest consequences. In the years that followed, historians would debate the causes of the disaster. Some blamed the commanders, others the intelligence officers, still others the men on the ground. But the truth is more complex. The mistake was not the fault of any one individual, but the result of a chain of decisions, each made in good faith, each compounding the errors of the last. It was a tragedy born of hubris, of the belief that victory was inevitable, that the enemy was beaten, that the war was all but won. Yet even in defeat, there is meaning. The men of the 106th and the thousands of others who fought in the Ardennes proved that courage and determination can endure even in the darkest of times. Their story is a reminder that history is not just a record of victories and defeats, but of the human beings who lived, fought, and died in its shadow. As the snow melted and the forests of the Ardennes returned to silence, the scars of battle remained. The villages and towns, the fields and roads, all bore witness to the struggle that had raged across them. For the survivors, the memories would never fade. The mistake that doomed an entire army became a part of them. A lesson written in the story of the 106th Infantry Division's ordeal in the Ardennes is not just a tale of military miscalculation and defeat. It is also a deeply human story, woven from the experiences of thousands of individuals, soldiers, officers, medics, chaplains, and civilians, whose lives were forever changed by the events of those bitter winter days. To understand how one mistake could doom an entire army, we must look beyond the maps and orders and listen to the voices of those who were there. Private First Class James "Jimmy" McAllister was 19 years old when he arrived in Belgium with the 423rd Regiment. Like many of his comrades, he had never seen combat before. The journey from basic training in the United States to the front lines of Europe had been a blur of ships, trains, and endless marching. The Ardennes, with its snow-covered hills and dense forests, seemed almost peaceful at first. The men joked about the ghost front, convinced that the war would pass them by. But on the morning of December 16th, Jimmy's world was transformed. The German artillery barrage shattered the stillness, sending men diving for cover as shells exploded all around them. The ground shook, trees splintered, and the air was filled with the screams of the wounded. Jimmy clutched his rifle, heart pounding, as the enemy advanced through the fog and snow. The training he had received seemed distant and inadequate in the face of such chaos. For the next 3 days, Jimmy and his squad fought desperately to hold their position. Ammunition ran low, and the cold seeped into their bones. They watched as friends were killed or wounded, as officers tried to rally the men and organize a defense. The Germans, better equipped and experienced, pressed their attack with relentless determination. By the evening of December 18th, Jimmy's unit was surrounded, cut off from the rest of the division. In the darkness, the decision was made to surrender. Jimmy and his fellow soldiers destroyed their weapons and equipment, then marched out of the woods with their hands raised. The humiliation and fear were overwhelming. They were herded together by German guards, stripped of their winter coats and forced to march for miles through the snow. Many collapsed from exhaustion or frostbite. For Jimmy, the journey into captivity was a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While Jimmy and thousands like him endured the misery of captivity, others continued to fight. Captain Helen Brooks, a nurse with the 331st Medical Battalion, worked tirelessly to care for the wounded. The aid stations were overwhelmed, supplies were scarce, and the threat of enemy attack was constant. Helen and her colleagues improvised with what they had, using torn uniforms as bandages and melting snow for water. She wrote in her diary, "We do what we can, but it never feels like enough. The wounded keep coming, and the shells never stop." The civilians of the Ardennes, too, were caught in the maelstrom. Families huddled in cellars as the battle raged above them. Villages changed hands multiple times. and the line between friend and foe was often blurred. Some risked their lives to shelter wounded soldiers or pass information to the Allies. Others, traumatized by years of occupation and war, simply tried to survive from one day to the next. The chaos of the battle created opportunities for both heroism and tragedy. In one village, a group of American engineers held off a German tank column for hours, using improvised explosives and sheer determination. In another, a miscommunication led to friendly fire, with devastating consequences. The fog of war was thick, and the margin for error was razor-thin. As the days passed, the scale of the disaster became clear. The loss of the 106th Regiments was not just a tactical setback. It was a blow to morale, a shock to the Allied command, and a propaganda victory for the Germans. Nazi radio broadcasts trumpeted the surrender, claiming that the invincible American army had been broken. In reality, the defeat was the result of a perfect storm of factors: overconfidence, faulty intelligence, logistical challenges, and the sheer audacity of the German plan. Yet even as the enemy celebrated, the seeds of their own defeat were being sown. The German offensive, though initially successful, was unsustainable. The rapid advance had outstripped supply lines, and the panzers were running out of fuel. The Allies, stung by the loss, responded with speed and determination. Reinforcements poured into the Ardennes, and the tide of battle began to turn. For the men of the 106th who escaped capture, the fight continued. Small groups evaded the German encirclement, moving by night and hiding by day. They relied on local civilians for food and shelter, and on their own wits to avoid detection. Some made it back to Allied lines, bringing with them vital information about enemy movements. Others were less fortunate, captured or killed in the attempt. The experience of captivity was a crucible for those who survived. The German prison camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and brutal. Food was scarce, disease was rampant, and the guards were often indifferent or hostile. Jimmy McAllister lost 30 pounds in 2 months, surviving on little more than watery soup and crusts of bread. He watched friends die of dysentery and pneumonia and wondered if he would ever see home again. Yet even in the darkest moments, there were flashes of humanity. Prisoners shared what little they had, looked out for one another, and found ways to maintain hope. Jimmy remembered a chaplain who organized secret Christmas services using a scrap of candle and a torn Bible. "It was the only time I felt like myself," he later recalled. "For a few minutes, we were more than just prisoners. We were men with families and dreams." Back on the battlefield, the Allies regrouped. The defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and outnumbered, held out against repeated attacks. General Patton's Third Army, moving with incredible speed, broke through the German lines and relieved the town. The German offensive, stalled and exhausted, began to collapse. The contrast between the fate of the 106th and the defenders of Bastogne is striking. Both faced overwhelming odds. Both were caught in the maelstrom of the German attack. But where the 106th was isolated and overwhelmed, the 101st was able to hold out, thanks to better preparation, stronger leadership, and a bit of luck. The difference was not just in tactics or numbers, but in the intangible qualities of morale, cohesion, and the will to fight. As the battle drew to a close, the survivors of the 106th were liberated from the prison camps. Many were unrecognizable, gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of deprivation. They returned home to a country that struggled to understand what they had endured. The story of their defeat was overshadowed by the larger narrative of victory in Europe. For years, their sacrifice was little remembered, their voices lost in the triumphalism of post-war America. But history is not just the story of victories. It is also the story of mistakes, of failures, and of the men and women who lived through them. The untold story of the 106th Infantry Division is a reminder that war is unpredictable, that even the best-laid plans can go awry, and that the cost of error is measured in human lives. In the decades since the war, historians have revisited the events of the Ardennes, seeking to understand how one mistake could have such far-reaching consequences. The answers are complex, rooted in the interplay of strategy, intelligence, leadership, and chance. The lessons are sobering. Never underestimate your enemy, never assume victory is assured, and never forget the human cost of war. For the men of the 106th, the memory of those days in the Ardennes would never fade. Some found solace in telling their stories, in honoring the comrades they had lost. Others struggled with guilt and trauma, haunted by the belief that they had failed. But in the end, their story is not one of shame, but of endurance. They did their duty, they fought as best they could, and they bore the consequences of decisions made far above their heads. The forests of the Ardennes are quiet now, the scars of battle softened by time and nature. But if you walk among the trees, you can still find traces of the past: rusted helmets, fragments of equipment, the outlines of old foxholes. These silent witnesses remind us that history is never truly past, that the mistakes and sacrifices of those who came before continue to shape our world. The untold story of how one mistake doomed an entire army is, in the end, a story about people, about their hopes and fears, their courage and frailty, their capacity for both error and redemption. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The aftermath of the 106th Infantry Division's ordeal in the Ardennes was felt not only on the battlefield, but also in the halls of power and in the hearts of those who survived. As the snow melted and the front lines shifted, the true cost of the mistake that doomed an entire army became clear. The loss of the 106th Regiments was more than a tactical setback. It was a blow to Allied confidence, a propaganda victory for the enemy, and a source of enduring pain for the families of the men who never returned. In Washington, London, and Paris, military leaders and politicians demanded answers. How had the Germans achieved such surprise? Why had the warnings of increased enemy activity been ignored? The official inquiries that followed were searching and, at times, harsh. Reports were written, blame was assigned, and lessons were drawn. The consensus was that a combination of overconfidence, faulty intelligence, and the dispersal of inexperienced troops across a dangerously wide front had created the conditions for disaster. General Allen W. Jones, the commander of the 106th, bore the brunt of the criticism. He was a capable officer, respected by his peers, but the circumstances he faced were beyond his control. The division had been in the line for less than 2 weeks when the German offensive began. Its men were green, its positions overextended, and its communications unreliable. Jones did what he could with the resources at hand, but the odds were stacked against him from the start. The official histories would later acknowledge these realities, but for many years, the story of the 106th was one of failure. The division's name became synonymous with defeat, its men unfairly stigmatized as the victims of their own inexperience. It would take decades for a more nuanced understanding to emerge, one that recognized the courage and resilience of the soldiers who fought and suffered in the Ardennes. For the families of the missing and captured, the weeks after the battle were a time of agonizing uncertainty. Telegrams arrived bearing the dreaded words, "Missing in action." Mothers and fathers, wives and children clung to hope, scanning the lists of prisoners and casualties for news of their loved ones. Some received word that their sons were alive, held in German camps. Others waited in vain, their hopes slowly fading as the months passed. The experience of captivity left deep scars on those who survived. The German prison camps were harsh and unforgiving. Food was scarce, medical care rudimentary, and the guards often brutal. The winter of 1944 to 45 was especially severe, and many prisoners died from exposure, disease, or malnutrition. For those who made it home, the memories of those months would never fade. Some struggled with nightmares and depression, unable to forget the faces of friends who had not survived. Yet even in the darkest moments, there were acts of kindness and solidarity. Prisoners shared what little they had, looked out for one another, and found ways to maintain hope. Some forged friendships that would last a lifetime, bound by the shared ordeal of captivity. Others found solace in faith, in letters from home, or in the simple rituals of daily life, scraping together a meal, telling stories, or marking the passage of time. Back on the front lines, the survivors of the 106th who had escaped capture were gradually absorbed into other units. Some joined the 7th Armored Division, others the 99th or 2nd Infantry Divisions. They brought with them hard-won experience and a determination to see the war through to the end. For many, the desire to avenge their fallen comrades was a powerful motivator. They fought with a grim resolve, determined that the mistake that had doomed their division would not be repeated. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, was a turning point in the war. The German offensive, though initially successful, ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. The Allies regrouped, counterattacked, and drove the enemy back across the Rhine. The cost was high, more than 80,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed. But the victory was decisive. The defeat in the Ardennes marked the end of Germany's ability to launch large-scale offensives in the West. In the years that followed, the story of the 106th Infantry Division was gradually reclaimed. Veterans organizations, historians, and family members worked to ensure that the sacrifices of the division's men were not forgotten. Reunions were held, memorials erected, and books written. The stigma of defeat was slowly replaced by a recognition of the courage and endurance displayed in the face of overwhelming odds. One such effort was the creation of the 106th Infantry Division Association, founded by survivors and their families. The association became a lifeline for many veterans, providing a space to share memories, honor the fallen, and support one another. Annual reunions brought together men who had fought side by side in the Ardennes, allowing them to remember, to grieve, and to heal. The association also played a key role in preserving the history of the division. Members collected letters, diaries, photographs, and official documents, creating an archive that would serve as a resource for future generations. They worked with historians to ensure that the story of the 106th was told accurately and fairly, challenging the myths and misconceptions that had grown up around the division's defeat. For the men themselves, the process of coming to terms with their experiences was often long and difficult. Some found it easier to talk about the war, to share their stories with family and friends. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to revisit the memories of those terrible days. The scars of battle were not always visible, but they were real and lasting. The story of the 106th Infantry Division is, in many ways, a story of redemption. It is a reminder that defeat is not the end, that courage and resilience can endure even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The men who fought and suffered in the Ardennes did not choose their fate, but they met it with dignity and resolve. Their story is a testament to the human capacity for endurance, for hope, and for renewal. As the decades passed, the forests of the Ardennes slowly healed. The scars of battle faded, the villages were rebuilt, and the fields returned to cultivation. But the memory of what happened there endures. Each year on the anniversary of the battle, veterans and their families return to the sites where they fought and bled. They walk the old roads, visit the cemeteries, and lay wreaths at the memorials. They remember the friends they lost, the hardships they endured, and the lessons they learned. For the people of Belgium, the memory of the battle is also a source of pride and gratitude. The sacrifices of the American soldiers who fought to liberate their country are honored and remembered. Monuments and museums dot the landscape, telling the story of the battle to new generations. The bonds forged in the crucible of war have endured, linking the people of Belgium and the United States in a shared history of struggle and sacrifice. The untold story of how one mistake doomed an entire army is, in the end, a story about the cost of war. It is a story about the dangers of complacency, the unpredictability of battle, and the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story that reminds us that history is not just a record of victories and defeats, but of the men and women who lived, fought, and died in its shadow. As we reflect on the events of the Ardennes, we are reminded that the lessons of the past are as relevant today as they were in 1944. The importance of vigilance, the need for humility, and the value of preparation are timeless truths. The story of the 106th Infantry Division is a cautionary tale, but it is also a source of inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is hope, and that the human spirit can endure even the greatest of trials.